Good evening, and welcome. Tonight, imagine for a moment a town so old that its chimneys seem to remember every winter that has ever passed through it. A town of narrow lanes and leaning rooftops, where the stones keep, the days cold long after sunset, and where, after the final bell has sounded and the last shutters have been drawn, a certain bakery does not quite go to sleep. By daylight, it is an ordinary place, or ordinary enough. Its windows are clouded with the breath of warm ovens. Its shelves hold braided loaves, sugared buns and crusts dusted pale with flour. People come and go with baskets under their arms and scarves wrapped high at their throats. Children press their hands to the glass. Workers stop in before dawn. Old women buy poppy seed cake in paper parcels. Nothing about it at first glance would suggest that it belonged to any world. But this one, and yet beneath that quiet surface, another life waited. For one hidden hour after midnight, when the clocks in the town had already done their counting, and even the inns had fallen still, the bakery opened again. Not for the crowds of mourning, not for the market wives, or the carters, or the men who liked their bread dark and heavy, but for those who wandered wakeful through the deeper part of night, for the dreamers who could not quite return to sleep, for the homesick, for the gentle-hearted insomniacs, and every so often for stranger guests still. If you had found the back lane and followed the warm thread of cardamom and yeast through the frost, if you had noticed the narrow side door, with its brass latch worn smooth by hands that mostly came after midnight, you might have seen a silver-eyed cat sitting on the step, as though he had been waiting for you. And that was where the story began to open, in an unexpected way, because the bakery's keeper, though kind and capable and famous for her apricot loaves, was not the only one watching over the place. There was also the cat. He was grey in some lights and silver in others, with fur the colour of moonlit smoke and eyes so bright and reflective that they seemed on certain nights to hold the last cold shine of the stars. He was not a large cat, nor especially theatrical in his behaviour. He did not spring upon tables, or beg from customers, or weave himself around ankles in search of praise. He moved with a composed and measured dignity, as though the rooms belonged to him, in a way no deed or key could ever fully explain. He inspected cooling racks. He sat beside the ovens, as if listening to them breathe. He stared at locked cupboards with unnerving patience. He appeared always exactly where he was needed, and in a place where old magic still lingered. That meant more than anyone said aloud. Our story belongs most properly to a winter evening, when the town had gone blue with cold, and the roofs were capped in a light frosting of snow. Somewhere far off, bells had already marked the late hour. Shop signs had been chained. Lanterns had been lowered. The river beyond the town wall moved black and quiet between edges of ice. Inside the bakery, the last of the day's work was ending. The floor had been swept twice, though there were still pale drifts of flour in the cracks between the boards. Trays had been stacked. Aprons hung to dry beside the kitchen hearth. The great brick oven was settling from its daytime labor into a slower and redder warmth. A few cardamom buns remained on the back shelf under cloth. A row of herb cakes, dark with honey and rosemary, waited beneath cooling nets. Somewhere in the pantry glass, jars clicked softly as the old house adjusted itself to the night. At the long wooden table near the window stood the youngest apprentice the bakery had taken in for years. Her name was Lina. She had come to the town in autumn, when the leaves had turned copper in the gutters and the market square smelled of pears and wood smoke. She was not yet fully grown, though she carried herself with the serious steadiness of someone used to earning her place. Her hands were quick, her listening was careful. She had learned to knead without tearing the dough, to read an oven's temper by scent alone, and to shape little crescent rolls so evenly that the baker Mistress Vale had once given a quiet nod of approval, and nothing more. In that bakery, it was considered high praise. Lina had stayed later than usual that evening. There had been extra work to do after a busy market day, and one of the older assistants had gone home early with a cough. So Lina washed mixing bowls in water gone warm and cloudy with flour. She polished measuring spoons, wiped the marble slab, covered the rye starter, folded cloths, brushed crumbs from the sill, and checked the larder inventory by lamplight, speaking the numbers softly to herself so as not to lose them. Outside, the town narrowed into silence. Inside, the warmth was close and golden. It was the kind of warmth that settles into old wood and old brick and old bones, the kind that gathers quietly in aprons and scarves and the cuffs of sleeves, the kind that makes a person, even after a long day, linger just one moment longer by the oven before stepping back into the cold. Lina might have finished then. She might have blown out 2 of the lamps, banked the embers, and gone up to the little room she rented above the cooper's shop. She might have wrapped her shawl tightly, crossed the sleeping square, and never known anything more of the bakery than most people did. But as she lifted the last basket from the lower shelf, she heard something, not a loud sound, only the faint, unmistakable click of the side door latch. She turned at once. The door at the back of the bakery was shut. The front was bolted. Mistress Vale had gone upstairs, nearly half an hour earlier, taking with her the daybook and the key ring that chimed at her waist. The windows reflected only lamplight and the hanging shine of copper pans. The hearth sighed softly. A spoon settled in a basin. Then the sound came again, a small metallic turn, a pause, and the hush of a door opening inward. Lina set the basket down very slowly. At first, she thought, quite sensibly, that perhaps Mistress Vale had returned, or perhaps one of the assistants had forgotten a scarf or a parcel of bread. Yet no footsteps followed, no voice called out. The air itself seemed to change, not with alarm, but with attention, as though the room had lifted its head, and from the shadow beside the flour bins emerged the silver-eyed cat. Lina had seen him all autumn and winter. Of course, everyone in the bakery knew him. He slept on sacks of flour in the early morning and vanished during the busiest afternoon hours. He appeared at dusk on the stair landing, or in the pantry doorway, or by the oven mouth, where the red light gilded the edges of his whiskers. Some said he had belonged once to Mistress Vale's mother. Some said he had simply arrived one rainy year and never left. Some said nothing at all, which in old towns often meant they suspected more than they wished to explain. Now he crossed the floor with a grave and noiseless tread, sat squarely before Lina, and looked at her, not vaguely in her direction, not with casual feline distraction, but directly, steadily, as though he expected her to understand something important. Lina stared back. The cat's tail curled once around his paws. His ears twitched toward the back room. His eyes, bright as polished coins in the lamplight, narrowed by the smallest degree. Then he stood, turned, and walked toward the side passage. He did not hurry. He did not check whether she followed. He simply moved with such certainty that after the briefest pause, Lina wiped her hands on her apron and went after him. The side passage was narrow and dim, lined with shelves of preserves, extra crockery, old trays, and bundles of dried lavender hung upside down from a beam. The air there was cooler, touched by the draft beneath the door. At the far end, the hidden side entrance stood open by the width of a hand, letting in a thread of winter air and the smell of chimney soot and snow. The cat sat beside it. Beyond the threshold lay the back lane, a place Lina knew only in daylight. Now it seemed altogether different. Frost silvered the cobbles. A lantern, hanging above the neighboring courtyard, swayed very gently, making the shadows shift on the walls. The world had that midnight stillness in which the smallest detail appears sharper than before. The rim of a bucket, the bent iron of a gate latch, the feathers of steam escaping some far chimney into the dark. And there, just outside the door, stood a customer. He was a very old man, in a dark coat, with a scarf of moss-green wool wrapped 3 times round his throat. He carried no basket. He leaned on a cane made from twisted hazelwood. Snow dusted the shoulders of his coat, though Lina had not heard him arrive. His face was kind, lined in the way old paper is lined, after much folding and unfolding, and he looked not surprised at all to see the door open. "Good midnight," he said softly. Lina opened her mouth, but before she could answer, the cat slipped between her skirts and the doorframe and walked into the lane, where he sat again with evident formality. The old man inclined his head to the cat. "Ah," he murmured. "So you are on duty?" Lina blinked. From somewhere above, on the unseen upper floor of the bakery, floorboards creaked. A moment later came the light, measured tread of Mistress Vale descending the back stairs. She appeared, holding a lamp in one hand, and quite astonishingly, wearing not her day apron, but a dark blue shawl, embroidered at the edge, with tiny stitched stars. Her silver-threaded hair had been rebraided. There was flour on one sleeve. Her expression, however, suggested that she found nothing at all remarkable in the scene before her. "You stayed late," she said to Lina, calm as ever. "I heard the latch," Lina said. "Yes," said Mistress Vale. "It does that." This was such an insufficient explanation that Lina nearly laughed, but something in the room prevented it. Not fear, not exactly solemnity, only the deep and peculiar sense that she had stepped into a pattern already long established, one that had no need to hurry itself. For her understanding, Mistress Vale set the lamp on the side shelf. Its glow turned the jars of quince preserve and plum compote into little stained glass moons. "Well," the baker said, adjusting her shawl, "since you are here, you may as well help. Put the kettle back on, uncover the cardamom tray, and do be polite. Midnight guests are often more fragile than morning ones." Lina stared. Midnight guests. Mistress Vale looked at her over the rim of her spectacles. "Yes," she said. "The bakery is reopening." And so it did, slowly, almost without noticing. The ordinary bakery changed, not into something theatrical, or sparkling, or unreal, nothing so noisy as that. Rather, the room seemed to deepen into its truest self. Lamps were relit, but only a few. Cloths were folded back from cooling loaves. The embers in the oven were coaxed into a brighter glow. A little brass bell, which Lina had never seen before, was set quietly on the back counter. The cat leapt to the flower shelf, where he sat, with his paws tucked beneath him, and watched the preparations with serene authority. The smell of the room changed too. Daytime bread had one kind of fragrance, hearty, bright, practical, alive with crust and steam. But the midnight bakery smelled warmer, stranger, softer around the edges, cardamom and orange peel, warm milk with honey skin forming. At the top, a trace of rosemary from the herb cakes, brown sugar melted into butter, the faint ghost of star anise, flour warmed again by oven breath, tea leaves waking in a tin. It was like stepping not into another place, but into the bakery's hidden heart. The old man entered first and took the seat nearest the oven. Without being asked, he held his hands to the heat with a look of relief so gentle it almost hurt to see. Mistress Vale wrapped 2 moon breads in a cloth and set them before him, with a small crock of salted butter. Lina had baked moon breads in the afternoon, without understanding why they were named so. Now, in the softer light, she saw it. Their crusts were brushed with milk and dusted with pale flour in a crescent pattern, so that they seemed almost to carry their own weathered glow. The old man thanked them with quiet seriousness. Then came a second customer. She arrived in a coat the color of wet leaves and carried a wicker cage, though it stood empty. Her hair was pinned up untidily, and there was hay on one sleeve. She smelled faintly of rosemary and frost. When Lina served her a slice of herb cake, the woman smiled with tired gratitude and said, "My owls would not settle tonight. They never do before snow." Lina did not ask why she kept owls. Something told her that midnight was not the hour for questions asked too quickly. Soon after came a seamstress from the riverside quarter who wanted sweet buns filled with pear. Then a watchman who removed his gloves, finger by finger, as though his hands had forgotten warmth. Then a woman with ink on her cuffs and violet shadows beneath her eyes, who carried 3 folded sheets of music and bought only tea and a single sugared roll. All of them greeted the cat, not extravagantly, not as though he were a circus trick or household pet, but with the grave courtesy one gives a person of standing. "Good evening, sir," said the watchman. The cat blinked slowly, still keeping order. "I see," murmured the seamstress. The cat turned his head a fraction, which somehow conveyed both acknowledgement and mild criticism. At one point, the woman with the music sheets paused before him and said, "You were right last week. The almond cakes helped." The cat rested one paw on the cupboard threshold. "Of course they did," said Mistress Vale, from the tea station, as though such conversations occurred every night. Lina worked as instructed, though her sense of reality had become pleasantly uncertain around the edges. She sliced moon bread, she poured tea, she brushed sugar over warm buns, she fetched apricot jam from the cold shelf and laid tiny forks beside saucers with more care than ever before in her life. Outside, the town slept on. Inside, the midnight hour unfolded like a secret woven carefully into the lining of the ordinary world. A little wind came down the chimney once, carrying the far smell of snow. The oven gave a soft brick tick as it settled. Steam rose from cups in pale twisting ribbons. Flour glowed in the warm light whenever someone passed too near the work table. The brass scales gleamed. The old floorboards creaked under measured feet, somewhere in the walls, as though from very deep inside the building. There came now and then a comfortable settling sound, like an old house sighing in approval. And still, the cat watched. He watched the oven doors. He watched the side entrance. He watched Lina, most particularly whenever she hesitated. Once, when she reached for the wrong jar of marmalade, he made a tiny sound in his throat. She turned He was staring at a different shelf. "You cannot possibly mean." Lina whispered. He continued staring. Cautiously, she took down the quince preserve instead and carried it to the customer's table. The woman with the ink-stained cuffs looked up in surprise and then smiled, not with politeness, but with genuine relief. "Oh," she said. "Yes, that's better." When Lina glanced back, the cat had already resumed, washing one paw as though none of it had been his doing. And yet, the true mystery was not in the strangeness of the customers, nor even in the impossible sense that the cat understood every need before it was spoken. It was in the feeling that the bakery itself was listening, that it knew who arrived at the hidden door and why, that it held certain flavors in readiness for certain hearts, that its cupboards and kettles and old worn counters remembered acts of kindness no one had written down, that the hour after the last bell was not merely secret, but necessary. Lina felt this most strongly when the door opened once more near the middle of the service, and a young man stepped in, hesitating on the threshold, as though he was not sure he belonged. He looked no older than Lina, perhaps a little older, with snow in his dark hair and tiredness gathered around his mouth. He held no coin purse. His coat was clean, but worn thin at the cuff. He stood with one hand still on the latch, ready, perhaps, to apologize and go. Before he could speak, the cat rose from the shelf. He leapt lightly to the counter, crossed it, without disturbing so much as a spoon, and sat directly beside a tray. Lina had not uncovered that night. It held 3 plain rolls, modest and unglazed, still warm under their cloth. Mistress Vale did not look surprised. She simply nodded once to Lina. Lina lifted the cloth, wrapped one of the plain rolls in paper, added, after the briefest pause, a small wedge of butter and a slice of honey cake, no larger than her palm. The young man stared. "I only wondered if there might be," he began. "There is," said Mistress Vale. His shoulders dropped, not in defeat, but in sudden relief, so profound it transformed his face. He took the parcel as though it were fragile. "Thank you," he said. The cat looked at him, long and searchingly, and then, with a quiet motion of his tail, directed his gaze toward the kettle. Lina understood at once. "Would you like tea as well?" she asked. For a moment, the young man could not answer. Then he nodded when he had taken his seat by the oven and wrapped his hands around the warm cup. The room grew even quieter than before, as though everyone present knew that something delicate had just been preserved, not solved, not cured, only held for one small hour in warmth. Lina returned to the work table with a peculiar fullness in her chest. She looked at the cat. He looked back. There was nothing dramatic in his gaze. No flash, no spell, no transformation. Only that same steady silver attention. But now it seemed to say, more clearly than before, that a bakery was never only a place where bread was sold. Some bakeries, at least, were made to keep watch over hungers people could not always name, night after night. Perhaps he had guarded that knowing, and Lina, without quite meaning to, had begun to understand. The hour continued. A pair of sisters arrived together, in cloaks dusted with snow, speaking so softly it was almost singing. One bought saffron buns. The other asked for warm milk with nutmeg. A man who smelled faintly of cedar and cold iron came for 2 rolls wrapped in blue paper and left one beside the side door before going. No one commented on this. At the far end of the shelf, the cat kept one eye half open, until the parcel had been placed. Just so, then shut it again in satisfaction. There were stranger customers too, though midnight made their strangeness feel gentle and oddly natural. Once, Lina saw, in the lane beyond the partly open door, a figure with antlers, outlined briefly against the lantern glow, waiting with patient courtesy until Mistress Vale handed out a loaf, seeded with fennel. Another time, she heard a soft flutter at the window and turned to find something small and pale, perched on the sill outside, a creature no larger than a curled mitten, with moth-like wings and an expression of monumental weariness. The cat rose, padded over, and with impeccable seriousness, nudged a sugared crumb toward the latch-side gap. The little being accepted it and vanished into the dark. Lina did not scream. She did not even gasp. By then, the whole room had taught her the proper scale of response. Some mysteries in that quiet corner of the world were not there to startle. They were there to be accommodated, given a saucer, wrapped in paper, sent gently back into the night. At last, the brass bell on the counter gave a note so soft it seemed to come from very far away. No one had touched it, yet at the sound, the remaining guests rose almost together, drawing gloves onto fingers, tucking parcels into pockets, fastening scarves, settling themselves once more into the colder shape of ordinary life. One by one, they thanked Mistress Vale. Several thanked Lina too, with an odd warmth that suggested she had crossed some invisible threshold of her own, and each, before leaving, acknowledged the cat. The old man in the moss-green scarf bowed his head. "Until tomorrow night," he said. The cat's whiskers twitched. Then the lane was empty once more. The side door was latched. The lamps were lowered. The special trays were covered. The oven settled back into its slow red breathing. The bakery looked almost ordinary again. Almost. Lina stood very still beside the work table, her hands lightly powdered with flour, her mind moving carefully around what she had seen. She half expected Mistress Vale to explain everything, at last, with some crisp, practical statement, as though midnight service for magical creatures and sleepless townsfolk were simply another branch of household management. But Mistress Vale only gathered cups onto a tray and said, "You folded the pear buns rather neatly." The seamstress noticed. Lina let out a breath that might have been a laugh. "What is this place?" she asked, softly. Mistress Vale considered. "A bakery," she said first. Then, because the answer was not unkind, but only incomplete, she added, "and something a little more. It has been this way a long time." Lina looked toward the cat. He had leapt down from the shelf and now sat before a narrow cupboard near the oven. One Lina had always assumed held spare linens or old account books. He was staring at it with extraordinary intensity. Mistress Vale followed her gaze and went still. For the first time that night, something unreadable crossed her face. Not fear, not quite worry, only the faintest shadow of concern, gone almost as soon as it appeared. She murmured. The cat did not move. "What is it?" Lina asked. Mistress Vale set down the tray. "I'm not yet certain," she said, "but the house is keeping something to itself." The words hung softly in the warm air. Outside, snow began at last to fall, in earnest, brushing the lane in silence. Inside, the oven breathed, the cupboard remained shut, and the silver-eyed cat, still and watchful, in the deep midnight hush, seemed to know that the story had only just begun. When morning came, The bakery looked almost too ordinary. The front bell rang, as it always did. Daylight spread pale and practical across the window glass. The town returned, in boots and scarves, and market voices carrying baskets, requests, gossip, and exact preferences regarding crust. A child cried because the honey twists were not yet cool enough to touch. Someone wanted 6 loaves cut and wrapped. A woman from the schoolhouse asked for seed bread and cinnamon rounds. The coal merchant stamped his boots twice on the threshold and filled the room with cold air. Everything was familiar again. And yet, for Lina, nothing was quite the same. She moved through the day's work with steady hands, but her thoughts kept slipping back to the midnight hour, as though drawn there by a hidden thread. The old man in the green scarf, the seamstress by the oven, the pale winged creature at the sill, the hush that had settled over the room. When the young man with no coin purse had accepted tea with both hands, most of all, the cat at the cupboard, so intent and still, beneath the low golden light, she found herself glancing toward him whenever she crossed the kitchen. He appeared, as usual, where he pleased. At dawn, he was stretched in a patch of sun, on the flour sacks, one paw over his nose, as though he had never, in his life, supervised a secret, nocturnal bakery. By noon, he had vanished entirely. By afternoon, he reappeared in the pantry doorway, inspecting deliveries of butter, with a stare that seemed faintly judgmental. Once, while Lina rolled out dough for cardamom knots, she looked up to find him watching the oven mouth rather than the room, his ears tilted forward in unusual concentration. The oven gave a quiet click, nothing more. Still, the cat did not relax. Slowly, almost without noticing, Lina began paying attention to small things. She might once have dismissed the crust on the second batch of brown loaves, darkened too quickly on one side. A pan of saffron buns rose unevenly, as though the warmth beneath them had shifted. While they baked, a tray of oat biscuits, usually dependable as sunrise, came out, with 3 edges pale and 1 row overdone. Even the kitchen itself seemed to notice. The room held its warmth, but not quite evenly. Here, one corner felt a little cooler than it should. There, the air near the mixing table carried a strange brief draft, though no window was open. Mistress Vale noticed too, though she said little. She tested the bricks with the back of her hand. She adjusted dampers. She listened at the oven mouth, with her head inclined. Once, Lina saw her rest, her fingertips very lightly on the cupboard the cat had stared at the night before, as though feeling for a pulse within the wood. At last, near evening, Lina gathered the courage to ask, "Is the oven unwell?" Mistress Vale, who was trimming strips of candied orange peel into a jar, paused before answering. "That is one way to put it," she said. "Can ovens be unwell? Old ones can. This," Lina felt, was not entirely about masonry. Mistress Vale sealed the jar and set it aside. "A bakery such as this," she said, "depends on more than fire and flour. Daytime trade keeps it standing. Good hands keep it running. But the midnight hour asks for something gentler, and gentler things are often easier to disturb." Lina thought of the customers who came, not only for bread, but for warmth, steadiness, kindness, a place prepared for them before they arrived. What disturbs it? Mistress Vale looked toward the window, where evening had begun turning the glass dusky blue. Neglect sometimes, forgetfulness, a broken habit, a kindness not offered when it should have been, or something in the town itself. drifting out of balance. She reached for her shawl. We do not guess. Too soon. Lina wanted, very much, to ask more, but the cat entered, just then, through the half-open pantry door. He did not stroll in as usual. He came with purpose. His fur, which often lay smooth as smoke, was slightly ruffled along the back, as though he had been somewhere windy. A tiny fleck of soot marked one ear. He crossed the kitchen, without greeting either of them, sprang lightly to the work table and stood beside the bowl of warm dough. Lina had just finished kneading. Then he placed one paw upon the cloth that covered it, not kneading, not testing, simply resting it there. With immense significance, Mistress Vale went still. "So," she murmured, "you've decided?" The cat looked at her, then at Lina. It was impossible, of course, for a cat to issue instructions. And yet, Lina felt instructed. "To do what?" she asked. Mistress Vale's eyes softened in that distant way they sometimes did, as though she were thinking not only of the present room, but of years layered behind it. "To take you along," she said. Lina blinked. "Take me where?" The cat hopped down from the table and headed toward the back stairs. He did not look behind him. He did not need to. Mistress Vale reached for the lamp hook by the wall and shook her head once, almost smiling. "Wrap your scarf well. Bring the basket by the pantry door, and wear your old boots. Not the good ones. My old boots. There may be soot." That was all the explanation she offered. So, in the hour between the last daylight customers and the first hush of night, Lina climbed the narrow stairs to fetch her wool coat and thick scarf from the peg by the back room. She changed into her oldest lace-up boots, the ones with softened leather and one stubborn buckle. She returned to find the basket already set out, as instructed. It was not a market basket, nor one for deliveries. It was shallow and wide, lined with cloth and filled in a most peculiar way. A jar of poppy seeds, a small wrapped bundle of fresh yeast, a paper of coarse salt, a round of butter, a flask of warm milk, 3 sprigs of rosemary, a little brass key on a cord, and 2 still warm rolls, tucked in one corner, beneath a folded napkin. Lina looked from the basket to Mistress Vale. Mistress Vale only nodded toward the stairs. The house above the bakery is older than the front room, the roof older than the shutters, the chimneys older than the stair rail. There are paths connected to those things that daytime hands need not know, but the cat knows them. He has always known them. At that, the cat, already waiting at the top of the stairwell, flicked his tail once with restrained impatience. Mistress Vale lowered. Her voice followed carefully. "Step where he steps when you can. Speak softly, if you must speak at all. And if he pauses at a threshold, do not cross before he does." Lina took up the basket. It was warm at the base, from the milk flask. "Are you not coming?" she asked. Mistress Vale drew the blue shawl more closely around her shoulders. "No, tonight. He wants you." There was something in the way she said it that made the answer feel less like a decision and more like the continuation of something already begun. So Lina followed the cat upstairs. The back stairs rose, past the storage room where sacks of rye were kept, past the little landing with the cracked blue tile no one ever replaced, past the narrow window overlooking the lane, where evening snow gathered lightly on the sill. Higher still, they went to a floor Lina had never entered, though she knew it existed. The old upper rooms beneath the sloping roof. The air changed there. It was not colder, not exactly, but touched by drafts. that carried old scents, long settled into the timbers. Dried lavender, chimney soot, apples stored in autumn, cedar boards, dust warmed by hidden flues. Somewhere, faintly, the sweet, dry fragrance of chamomile. The ceilings dipped low in places, between beams, blackened by age. The floorboards spoke more readily there, with long, soft creaks underfoot. Shadows gathered in corners, where trunks were stacked and folded screens leaned against walls. The cat moved through it all with complete assurance. He led Lina down a passage lined with old framed prints of harvest fields and moon phases. He slipped through a half-open linen room, across an unused sewing chamber, and into a narrow alcove where a ladder rose to a square door in the ceiling. There, he stopped. He looked down, then up, then at Lina. She set down the basket. "You cannot mean that," she whispered. He touched the lower rung with one paw. Behind her, from somewhere lower in the house, came the distant familiar sound of Mistress Vale, sliding bread peels into their hooks. Such a homely sound, so steady and ordinary, made the strange little ladder seem stranger still. Lina drew a breath, took up the basket again, and climbed. The trapdoor was lighter than she expected. It opened with a wooden sigh and let down a drift of colder air, touched by snow and chimney smoke. Lina lifted herself through, carefully, then rose to her knees on the roof walk above the bakery. The town spread around her, in quiet astonishment. She had crossed those streets dozens of times, perhaps hundreds, but never seen them from above. In the winter night, the rooftops ran in slanting lines, and clustered chimneys, capped in soft white. Lanterns glowed amber, here and there below, casting small pools onto the lanes. The square beyond the church was mostly dark now, the market stalls closed and blanketed. Farther off, windows shone, behind curtains, like rows of contained stars. The river was a black ribbon, edged with pale frost. Snow drifted slowly through the air, not in gusts, but in patient downward spirals, making each sound seem farther away than it was. And over everything lay that strange suspended calm that belongs only to sleeping towns. The cat was already ahead of her. A narrow path of old planks ran between brick chimney stacks and sloping tiles, hidden from the street below by the angle of the roof. Lina followed carefully, the basket balanced in the crook of one arm. Her boots slipped once on a patch of frost, and the cat paused, long enough to look back with such sharp disapproval that she immediately steadied herself. "Yes, all right," she muttered. "I see." They crossed the bakery roof first, where heat still rose faintly through the brick, near the main oven flue. There, the snow had melted into shining dark patches. A little farther on, they came to a sheltered nook between two chimneys, where several terracotta pots sat under overturned baskets. The cat stopped beside them. Lina crouched. Inside the baskets were herbs, not dead winter stubs, as she expected, but living plants, protected by brick warmth and careful covering. Rosemary, thick and blue-green, tiny dark leaves of thyme, a pot of winter mint, and, in the corner, a low broad planter filled with something silvery and soft that released, when she touched it, a faint scent, like sage and rain. The cat nudged the rosemary sprigs, protruding from the basket she carried. "Oh," Lina whispered. She set the new sprigs alongside those already packed. The cat then moved to a little earthen bowl near the chimney base. It was dry and empty. Lina hesitated. Then she uncorked the milk flask and poured a little into the bowl. The cat watched very closely. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, from a crack in the warm brickwork, something small stirred. Out came not a mouse, but a creature no larger than a teacup, with folded, soot-dark wings and a face like a drowsy fox drawn from memory. It blinked once, twice, and lapped delicately at the milk. Lina held still, enough to feel the snow touching her eyelashes. The cat sat down beside the bowl, like a steward supervising a formal visit. "What are you?" Lina whispered. The little creature ignored the question and drank on. When it had finished, it bowed, not to Lina, but to the cat, then vanished back into the brick. The cat rose at once and continued onward. Lina followed in silence, her thoughts widening around the simple fact that the rooftops above the town were not empty at all. They were lived in by things no one spoke of. At market, small night creatures, hidden gardens, warm corners built into old houses by custom and care, invisible arrangements that kept some deeper order gently turning. They crossed next to the neighboring roof by way of a narrow plank bridge set so neatly between the eaves that Lina suspected it had been there for many years, unnoticed. Beneath it lay a little courtyard where laundry lines now hung stiff and silver with frost. The neighboring building belonged to the cooper's widow, but beyond that roof rose a steeper one belonging to the old printmaker's shop. There, beneath a dormer window, the cat paused before a wooden box mounted under the eaves. A dovecote. Lina knew, of course, that town messengers kept pigeons and doves, but this was unlike any she had seen. It was painted blue long ago, though the color had weathered to the softness of old sky. Tiny brass moons had been nailed along the edge. A little curtain of beads hung over the lower opening to keep out the sharpest drafts. From within came a sound like gentle shuffling silk. The cat touched the brass key tied into the basket cord. With one paw, Lina used it to open the side hatch. Inside the dovecote, all was feather warmth and sleepy breath. Small pale doves nestled in straw-lined compartments, their feathers puffed against the cold. A few opened dark, bright eyes. As the hatch swung wide, tucked behind them were little paper packets tied with thread, dried petals, fennel seed, one packet labeled in a careful hand for fog nights, another for when the bells fail to carry. Lina turned to stare at the cat. He, in return, looked at one empty compartment, so she placed inside it one warm roll from the basket, torn into pieces, and sprinkled a pinch of poppy seed over the top. The nearest dove cooed once, deeply satisfied. Below them, a church bell marked the quarter hour with a softened tone. Snow whispered over slate somewhere farther off. A door closed. The town continued, sleeping, unaware that above its chimneys an apprentice was feeding hidden birds under the supervision of a silver-eyed cat. And yet, beneath that quiet surface, something still felt not quite right. Lina noticed it as they moved on. Several chimneys breathed their smoke, clean and straight, into the night, but here and there, a few columns of smoke bent oddly, as though meeting resistance. The air along one ridge felt colder than the rest, and the cat slowed there, sniffing the wind. When they passed above the lane, behind the tailor's shop, he stopped altogether and peered down toward a darkened archway, overgrown with winter ivy. Lina looked too, though she saw nothing unusual. Only shadows, frost, a stack of crates, a lantern gone out. Still, the cat remained motionless, for so long that she began to understand the quality of his attention. It was not merely seeing, it was tending, measuring, listening for some imbalance beneath appearances. At last, he moved on, but not with satisfaction. They came next to an old grain loft attached to what had once been a mill storehouse and was now mostly unused, except during harvest seasons. Lina had passed its large lower doors, often without a glance. From the street, it looked closed, dusty, and irrelevant in winter. But on the roof, a different story appeared. A small side hatch, almost invisible, under the eaves, stood slightly open. The cat went there directly. Lina crouched and peered in. Warmth rose from within, not oven heat, but the rich, dry warmth of grain held in wood. The loft smelled of husks, rye, cedar bins, and old sunlight. Trapped in summer stalks, suspended from the beams, hung braids of onions, bunches of dried chamomile, and little cloth charms stitched with simple patterns of wheat heads and stars. On a central shelf sat 3 ceramic jars. One was empty. One held barley. One held what looked like flour, though it shimmered oddly pale in the dark. The cat looked at the empty jar, then at the bundle of fresh yeast in Lina's basket. "You want me to leave this here?" she asked. He blinked once. She set the yeast carefully into the jar and tucked the cloth over it. The moment she did, a small draft moved through the loft, carrying the unmistakable smell of rising dough, not from the jar, from below. Lina straightened and turned toward the direction of the bakery. Even at this distance, across joined roofs and chimneys, she felt a subtle answer passing through the old structures of the town, as though one hidden place had just heard from another. The cat, too, seemed to feel it, his posture eased by the smallest degree. That was when Lina understood that these rooftop errands were not random at all. They were maintenance, caretaking, a pattern of nourishment and noticing spread quietly through the upper reaches of the town. Above ordinary sight, herbs replenished, milk left where it was needed, birds fed, yeast restored to its place, invisible neighbors acknowledged, warmth carried from one threshold to another. And the cat had been tending all of it for longer than anyone said aloud. What seemed like a simple task had deeper roots than anyone realized. The words formed in Lina's mind with such clarity that she almost thought she had heard them spoken. She looked at the cat with entirely new respect. "You do all this every night?" He did not answer. Of course, but he turned and began walking toward the far ridge, where the roofs climbed higher toward the older quarter of town, which was answer enough. The path narrowed there. Snow lay thicker. Chimneys leaned at eccentric angles, and some were bound with old iron braces, gone dark with weather. Here, the town showed more clearly its age. Repaired tiles beside ancient ones, patched masonry, carved drain spouts, worn, smooth by rain. Lina went more slowly, gripping the basket with numb fingers, though its contents still gave off pockets of warmth. At last, they reached a hidden garden. It lay behind a row of chimney stacks on a roof terrace no street below could ever have guessed at. 3 walls sheltered it from the wind in summer. Lina thought it must be green. Even now, it retained a quiet life. Winter herbs in clay tubs, a little espaliered tree, bare of leaves but threaded with tiny bells that stirred when the wind changed, a bench covered in folded sailcloth, lantern hooks, a low table of stone. On the far parapet, bowls set out to catch snowmelt. It was less like a garden than a rooftop chapel, built for tenderness. At its center stood a shallow brick hearth, no bigger than a wash basin, cold. The cat leapt onto its rim and stared at it. Lina set down the basket. She knew by now not to rush, so she looked carefully. Ash lay in the little hearth, but old ash, undisturbed. Beside it stood a copper lighter, a bundle of rosemary twine, and a jar of coarse salt, clumped slightly with damp. One of the snowmelt bowls had cracked from frost and tipped sideways. The bells in the bare branches gave a faint, uneven note. "This place has been missed," Lina whispered. The cat met her gaze, not accusatory, only sad, and that sadness, softened by snow and silence, and the sleeping town all around them, moved her more than any dramatic revelation could have done, because it was not the sadness of disaster. It was the sadness of a good thing, left unattended, a ritual, once known by heart, and then, somehow, forgotten. Lina knelt at once. She righted the bowl, swept old snow from the hearth rim with her sleeve, crumbled fresh rosemary over the basin, added a pinch of salt, broke the second warm roll into pieces, and set them on the parapet edge, near the bells. Then, after one uncertain glance at the cat, she took a coal striker from the hearth tools and coaxed a tiny flame into the rosemary twine. The herbs caught softly, fragrance rose, rosemary first, then a note of warm resin, then the very faint, sweet smell of bread crust from the crumbs heating nearby. The bells in the bare tree stirred again, this time with a sound more even than before. Below, very far below, Lina heard something, a door opening, a laugh, a cart shifting in its sleep against a wall, and then, from the direction of the bakery, the low-beloved exhale of an oven drawing steady once more. The cat closed his eyes, only for a moment, but in that moment, the whole garden seemed to settle around them, as though the place had been waiting to be remembered. Lina sat back on her heels, breath clouding before her face. "To understand that," she murmured, "you really do have to follow the old path a little farther." The cat opened one eye, as if to say that she was finally learning. They remained there a few minutes more, while the rosemary thread burned down and the snow drifted around them in slow white intervals. One small bird, winter pale and round as a puff of flour, came silently to the parapet, took a crumb, and vanished again. Far off, over the roofs, the sky had begun to clear, enough for a few stars to show through. Then the cat stood. There was one more place to visit. He led Lina down from the garden by another hidden roof path, this one descending toward the older chimneys above the lane behind the bakery. Here, the air smelled more strongly of soot and warm brick. A tangle of flues ran together through the joined houses, sending pulses of heat beneath the snow. The cat moved more slowly with each step. His ears pricked. At last, he stopped before a squat chimney stack, banded with iron. It looked unremarkable at first. Old brick, soot blackening the upper lip, a clay pot cap slightly askew. But when Lina drew nearer, she felt it at once. Cold, not the ordinary outdoor cold. A deeper, wronger chill, centered in the brick itself, as if a current had gone astray. Inside the walls, the cat touched the lower mortar line. With one paw, Lina set down the basket. For the last time, and laid her hand against the chimney. The bricks were not merely cold, they were damp. She frowned, looked upward, saw just above the iron band a hairline crack running along the mortar where melting snow must have slipped in and frozen again and again. Such a small thing, a seam no wider than a thread, the sort of flaw no one on the street would ever notice, but perhaps that was enough. A hidden draft into the flue, a break in the warmth, a slow unsettling of the paths by which heat, scent, and whatever gentler magic the bakery relied upon moved through its old connected spaces. Lina drew a breath. "So this is it," she whispered. The cat did not look relieved, only intent, as though finding the wound was not the same as healing it. She rummaged through the basket. Butter, no. Poppy seeds, no. Then her fingers found the folded square of waxed cloth Mistress Vale had tucked beneath the salt packet. Without explanation, inside lay a little lump of sealing clay mixed with straw fibers and herbs for chimney cracks. Lina thought suddenly, or for something like them. She smiled, despite herself. Mistress Vale knew. Of course she had. Lina pressed the clay gently along the seam, working it into the crack with chilled fingers. The material warmed under her touch and released a faint, clean smell, somewhere between hay and mint. When the seam was filled, she dusted it with a pinch of salt. As the cat watched, the wrong cold lingered. Another moment, then lessened, not vanished. Lessened enough, perhaps, for tonight. Enough for the ovens to breathe more evenly. Enough for the midnight door to remain findable. Enough for the hidden currents of warmth and kindness to continue moving. While a deeper repair was made, the cat looked toward the bakery roof, and in that look was approval. It was small, it was quiet, it was everything. Lina rose, slowly, flexing her stiff hands. Snow gathered on her sleeves. The town below remained peacefully unaware of the repair just made above its sleeping chimneys. Yet she felt, with a certainty deeper than explanation, that many things depended on such unnoticed acts. Not only bread, not only midnight creatures, but the gentle functioning of places meant to shelter the tired and the wakeful. They turned back at last, toward home. The return felt different. The rooftops no longer seemed like a hidden wilderness of odd passages and secret thresholds. They felt connected now, almost domestic, in their own elevated way, not wild, but cared for. A second town, above the town, a place of dovecote, herb pots, warm bricks, tiny bowls of milk, repaired cracks, remembered offerings, and paths walked so often by a silver-eyed cat that they had become, in their own fashion, a kind of prayer. By the time Lina climbed back through the trapdoor, her cheeks were bright with cold and her boots dusted in soot. The upper rooms seemed warmer than before. Below, in the kitchen, the oven breathed with a steadier rhythm, not perfect, but improved. Lina could hear it, even from the stairhead. That pleased her, more than she expected. Mistress Vale was waiting by the long table, with a kettle, 2 cups, and a plate of buttered toast sprinkled lightly with cinnamon. She looked once at Lina's sleeves, once at the cat, and nodded. "The herb garden?" she asked. "Yes." "The dovecote?" "Yes." "The loft?" "Yes." Mistress Vale poured tea, and the north flue seam by the iron band. Lina stared. "You knew exactly where it was." "I suspected," Mistress Vale said. She pushed 1 cup toward her. "He prefers confirmation." The cat leapt lightly onto the bench by the oven and began washing soot from his shoulder. Lina sat down, with the tea between her palms. The warmth sank wonderfully into her fingers. For a few moments, none of them spoke. The bakery held that post-midnight stillness that is not silence, exactly, but the soft resting hum of a place still alive, under low light. Finally, Lina said, "He's been teaching me." Mistress Vale smiled into her cup. "Yes," she said, "that does happen." Lina looked toward the cat, who paused mid-wash, just long enough to glance at her, with one luminous silver eye outside. Snow continued to fall over the narrow old town. Inside, dough rested. Beneath cloth, the ovens breathed more evenly, and somewhere above, the sleeping roofs, little hidden places, were once again supplied, warmed, and remembered. But the true mystery was not solved, not yet, because the broken chimney seam explained the uneven heat. Yes, and perhaps some part of the fading midnight hour, but Lina could feel, as surely as she had felt, the cold in the brick, that something deeper still moved beneath it all, some older tenderness, some long-kept pattern she had only begun to glimpse among the dovecotes and herb bowls and winter roofs, and the cat knew it. He knew, perhaps, that the bakery's warmth had never come from fire alone. He knew why certain customers arrived without knocking, why certain loaves were ready before anyone asked, why moon bread mattered, why tea must sometimes be offered before a person admitted hunger, why a rooftop hearth should never be allowed to go cold for too many nights. The journey across the roofs had shown Lina the outer paths. What it had not yet shown her was the hidden heart they served. That would come later. For now, there was tea, there was cinnamon on toast, there was the low red comfort of the brick oven, and there was the silver-eyed cat drying one soot-marked paw beside the warmth, as though nothing in the world were more natural than tending a sleeping town from above its chimneys. Good evening, once more, and let us return to the bakery. In that narrow winter town, where the snow had settled over the roofs like folded linen, and where the hour after midnight was beginning, slowly and almost imperceptibly, to ask for something more than skill. By the next evening, the ovens were steadier, not perfect. No, a tray of plum buns, still browned faster, on the back left than on the right, and one loaf of rye emerged with a pale crescent along its underside, as though the heat had hesitated there before finding its confidence again. But the room no longer felt troubled in quite the same way. The wrong little draughts had quieted. The warmth held more evenly in the corners. The kettles sang with their usual soft certainty. Even the floorboards seemed to settle into themselves with relief. Mistress Vale said very little about any of this. She had the particular calm of someone who knew that many repairs, especially the important ones, should not be praised too quickly. She went about the evening's work with measured attention, tying aprons, checking the rise of dough, trimming candied peel, adjusting lamp wicks, one careful turn at a time. Yet Lina noticed that once, when she thought no one was looking, the baker rested her fingertips lightly against the oven bricks and closed her eyes for just a moment, as though thanking the room for holding fast. The cat, meanwhile, was watchful in a different way now. He was no less dignified, no less impossible. But Lina began to feel that his attention had shifted. Before, he had seemed to be measuring the bakery for signs of harm. Now, he seemed to be measuring her, not sternly, not suspiciously, only with that same silver stillness, as though he were waiting to see what she might understand without being told. That evening, the ordinary business of the shop closed a little earlier on account of the weather. Snow had thickened outside, falling in patient white veils through the lantern light. Fewer customers ventured out after dusk. Those who did came in flushed and grateful, dusting their shoulders at the door, asking for dense bread and honey buns, and anything that would hold warmth all the way home. A schoolmaster bought 2 onion loaves and a currant tart. A pair of sisters, in matching mittens, argued mildly over whether seed cake improved in the cold. A tired father arrived with a sleeping child tucked inside his coat and accepted, with genuine emotion, a paper packet of sugared twists Mistress Vale added, for free. Lina noticed that he was on the shelf above the flour bin, his tail hanging neatly over the edge. When Mistress Vale slipped the extra twists into the parcel without charge, his ears relaxed. The gesture was so small that another apprentice might have missed it. But Lina no longer missed such things. Later, after the last guest had gone and the side door was barred again against the snow, Lina found the cat waiting, not by the oven, not by the back stairs, but beside the narrow cupboard he had watched so intently on that first midnight, up close. It was an unremarkable thing. Dark wood, iron hinge, old latch, slightly warped from the years. It stood half hidden between the brick oven wall and a narrow bank of shelves where jars of citrus peel and barley flour were kept. The cat sat before it, as before, only now, instead of staring, he reached up and touched the latch. Once, then again, Lina set down the tray she was carrying. Mistress Vale, the baker, who was extinguishing the last of the low lamps, looked over with no surprise at all. "Yes," she said, "it seems he thinks you are ready." "For what?" "To see why the midnight hour exists at all." Those words moved through Lina like the first cold breath when a hidden door opens. Mistress Vale crossed the room, wiping her hands on a linen cloth. Up close, the cupboard seemed older than the surrounding wood. Its handle had been repaired more than once. The edges were worn pale where fingers had touched it over many years. "It is not grand," the baker said quietly. "Most important things are not." She lifted the latch. The cupboard door opened inward. Inside, there were no linens, no ledgers, no spare jars, only shelves, 3 narrow wooden shelves, and upon them objects so humble that, for a moment, Lina did not understand what she was looking at. A folded paper packet, tied with blue thread, a small earthen bowl, a chipped cup, with a handle repaired in silver, a square of faded cloth, embroidered with wheat heads, a little beeswax candle, no taller than a thumb, a tin of coarse sugar, a corked bottle of milk, a jar of dried chamomile, a heel of bread wrapped in linen, a child's spoon, carved from pear wood, a neat bundle of writing paper, a spool of strong mending thread, a tiny bottle of lavender oil, a sealed envelope with no name on it, and, on the middle shelf, behind all the rest, an old ceramic crock, half filled with starter. Nothing glowed, nothing shimmered, nothing announced itself as magical, and yet, the instant the cupboard opened, the room changed. The air grew warmer, but not by heat. Warmer, the way a memory can warm you, the way a familiar voice in a dark house can warm you, the way being expected somewhere can warm you. A gentleness spread through the bakery, so quietly and so thoroughly that Lina felt tears gather in her eyes. Before she knew why, the cat stepped closer and sat beside the open cupboard. like a keeper revealing an altar. Mistress Vale touched the rim of the old crock. My grandmother called it the kindness starter, she said, though even then she said the name was older than she was. Lina looked at the crock. It appeared ordinary enough. Clay, cracked glaze, flour dried along the inner lip, but the starter within it carried a scent. Unlike the other bowls in the kitchen, it smelled of yeast, certainly, and of old grain, but also of apple skin, warm milk, honey, and something deeper still, something accumulated and patient, as though years of hearth smoke and winter care had been folded quietly into it. This, said Mistress Vale, is what feeds the hidden hour. Lina looked from the crock to the shelves around it. I don't understand. No, said Mistress Vale gently, but you are beginning to. She leaned one hip against the counter and regarded the open cupboard, not as one looks at a secret, but as one looks at an inheritance. In the old years, she said, before I was born, before my mother was born, this town had many trades, but few luxuries. Winters were longer then, or perhaps only felt longer. There were losses, illnesses, flood years, and years of poor grain, night workers who were paid in weariness. More than coin, children who did not sleep because their mothers were coughing, men who walked home from the river in weather no one should have walked through, women who kept house after burying someone in the morning and still had to light the stove before dark. Her voice never sharpened, never dramatized. She simply laid the truths down, one by one, as carefully as setting cups on a table. And in such a town, she continued, someone began leaving things aside. She touched the little bowl, the sugar tin, the folded cloth, a roll that was not sold, a little milk kept warm, a sweet bun wrapped in paper, tea ready after midnight. For those who could not rest, bread sent quietly where grief had arrived, cakes put by for children, too worried to feel hungry until late. No sermons, no announcements, no account entered in the daybook, only the habit of making sure that if someone came to the door at the wrong hour for ordinary business, there would still be something ready. Lina listened without breathing. That is all, she whispered. Mistress Vale smiled in that small grave way of hers. All? She said. My dear, that is never all. She lifted the child's carved spoon from the shelf and turned it in her fingers. Kindness repeated becomes custom. Custom kept faithfully becomes trust. Trust in a house built of bread and fire and patient hands becomes its own kind of leavening. Over years, then generations, the bakery learned to expect such acts. The walls learned, the ovens learned, the night itself learned. Lina thought of the midnight guests, how they arrived, not hopefully, but knowingly, as though following an old invitation, still quietly in force. She thought of the rooftop hearth gone cold from being forgotten, the dovecote packets labeled for fog nights, the bowl of milk hidden in the chimney nook, the plain roll and tea for someone who had not yet asked, the extra hand pie for tomorrow. The cat sat very still, his silver eyes half lowered. So the magic, Lina said slowly, is not spells. Mistress Vale replaced the spoon. Oh, there are spells in the world, she said. Some useful, some ridiculous, some best avoided entirely. But this bakery was not built on tricks. It was built on attention, on noticing, on keeping back a little warmth for whoever might arrive, needing it most. That is a stronger thing than many spells, and more difficult too. Lina turned again to the cupboard shelves. Every object now seemed charged with meaning, not because it was rare, but because it was specific, chosen, prepared in advance for a need that might or might not come. A spoon for a tired child, sugar for someone faint with sorrow, writing paper for a person who had at last decided to send a letter, lavender oil for a sleepless widow, mending thread for a coat that must last one more winter, a candle for someone afraid of the dark walk home, and the old starter at the center of it all, carrying forward not only yeast but intention, the yeast of old kindness. The phrase came to Lina with such quiet force that she almost thought the room itself had spoken it. Mistress Vale must have seen something in her face, because she nodded. "Yes," she said softly. "Exactly that." For a few moments, none of them moved. Snow touched the window panes. The oven breathed low and red. The open cupboard gave out that impossible warmth of being thought of before asking. Then Lina said, "If this has always been here, why is it fading now?" Mistress Vale was silent, long enough that the question seemed to travel through the whole room before returning. "Because usefulness is easier to maintain than tenderness," she said at last. "A bakery can become efficient and still be admired. Orders can be filled, shelves can be neat, accounts can balance, bread can rise. But if no one remembers to look beyond the purchase, something finer begins to thin." She gestured lightly toward the front room beyond. "In recent years, we have been busy. More trade, more orders for inns, more wedding cakes, more market contracts. Good fortune, in many ways, but busy hands can become narrow hands. A kindness delayed becomes a kindness forgotten. The little extra portion is not set aside. The note is not tucked into the parcel. The hearth on the roof goes unlit. The milk is not left for the chimney folk. The plain rolls are counted too tightly. The midnight hour continues for a while because old things are patient, but patience is not the same as endlessness." Lina felt the truth of it, like a bell sounding somewhere deep in the house. Not accusation, recognition. She remembered mornings when every tray had been measured to the crumb, every order tallied, precisely every task completed, cleanly and well. She remembered her own private pride in speed, in neatness, in not wasting. None of that had been wrong, but none of it, by itself, could have nourished what she had felt on her first midnight in the room. "And the cat?" she asked. Mistress Vale looked down at him. The cat, as though aware he was the subject of discussion, lifted one paw and rested it lightly on the cupboard threshold. "What about him?" said the baker. "How long has he been here?" Mistress Vale's expression altered in that almost smile she wore whenever the truth was less tidy than the question. "Longer than I have," she said. "Longer than my mother, I suspect. Perhaps not in any way that would satisfy a scholar, but in the ways that matter here, yes." Lina stared. I mean," said Mistress Vale, "that some houses, if loved enough and tended well enough, begin keeping their own guardians. I do not ask for precise explanations. In such matters, he arrived before my childhood memory begins. And my grandmother spoke of him as though he had always been scolding the oven bricks and supervising the moon bread. That is sufficient for me." The cat yawned, not modestly, not theatrically, simply with the air of one bored by discussions of his own legend. Lina laughed then, very softly, and the sound itself seemed to brighten the room. "But if he guards kindness," she said, "why didn't he simply make someone remember? Because that is not how guardianship works," Mistress Vale replied. He can watch, lead, nudge, refuse to let certain threads break entirely. But generosity given under compulsion is not generosity. The bakery must choose its own tenderness again and again, or the hidden hour becomes only performance. That, more than anything, settled the truth of the matter. In Lina's heart, not spectacle, not enchantment, for its own sake, choice, the choice to prepare for the lonely before they knocked, to set aside warmth without guarantee of payment, to remember tomorrow's hunger while serving tonight's, to care. Not only that bread be baked, but that it arrive with gentleness attached. And yet, the true mystery was not only the cupboard, or the cat, or even the old starter, breathing quietly in its crock. It was how many such histories might lie folded inside ordinary places, hidden beneath efficient surfaces. How many shops, kitchens, porches, workshops, and rooms might once have kept secret practices of care that no ledger ever recorded. How often the world is held together, not by grand gestures, but by the repetition of modest mercies. Lina felt very small then, but not in a lonely way, in a belonging way, as though she had been invited into something old and exacting and beautiful, not because she was special, but because she was willing to learn how to notice. Mistress Vale closed the cupboard halfway, though not all the way. "Come," she said. "There is one more thing." She took the old crock of starter in both hands and carried it to the work table. The cat followed immediately. Lina came too, drawn by the warm, faintly sweet scent rising from the bowl. Mistress Vale set out. Flour, warm water, salt, and a little honey. "We feed it every midnight," she said, "not because yeast requires ceremony, but because memory does." She spooned a portion of the starter into a clean bowl, then handed the wooden spoon to Lina. "Mix." Lina did. The starter stretched slowly, silkier than any she had worked with before, and as she folded in fresh flour and warm water, she felt an odd and deep steadiness settle into her hands. Not magic, in the glittering sense, more like entering a rhythm already worn smooth by years of repetition. The spoon turned, the dough thickened, the scent rose. Warm grain, milk, a little apple, a little honey, old hearth, old patience. Mistress Vale added the pinch of salt, then, after a moment, the tiniest thread of honey. The cat watched with complete approval. "What is the honey for?" Lina asked. "It reminds the starter what it is for," said Mistress Vale. That answer should have sounded fanciful. Instead, it felt exact. When the bowl was covered at last with linen, Mistress Vale placed it back in the cupboard. Beside the old crock, the child's spoon went next to it, then the folded cloth, then the sugar tin, each returned. Not randomly, but according to a pattern so practiced it felt almost musical, a liturgy of small preparedness. Later, as the final lamp was lowered and the side lane disappeared under fresh snow, Lina lingered near the oven with the cat beside her. His body was warm from the bricks. One ear still carried the faint soot mark from the night before. What appeared gentle on the surface carried an older sadness underneath. The thought came to her as she watched the room, because now she understood that the midnight bakery was beautiful, not merely because it was secret, but because it existed in answer to sorrow, to wakefulness, to grief, to those hours in a human life when one needs nourishment and does not know how to ask for it without shame. Its sweetness had roots in ache, its warmth had roots in winter. Its magic had roots in mercy. No wonder it weakened. When attention narrowed, no wonder the cat had gone, pacing the roofs. Lina bent to stroke him very carefully between the shoulders. He accepted this without enthusiasm, but without objection, which from him felt almost extravagant. "I see," she whispered. The cat opened his eyes and looked at her for the first time. Lina thought she truly did, and because understanding has a way of changing action almost at once. The next midnight unfolded differently. Before the old man in the green scarf arrived, Lina had already set out the moon bread and softened butter. Before the seamstress came in from the riverside, the kettle was singing and the pear buns were wrapped warm. When the musician entered with ink-stained cuffs and winter-shadowed eyes, there was rosemary cake, and beside it, one sheet of fresh folded paper, tucked discreetly under the saucer. When the watchman stamped snow from his boots, a flask of something hot had already been set by the counter for his rounds. When the young man in the worn coat hesitated at the threshold, there waited not only a plain roll, but soup in a corked jar, thick enough to warm his hands. No one announced these things. No one made speeches. Nothing became sentimental or loud. The bakery simply remembered itself, and in remembering, it brightened. The lamplight seemed deeper. The fragrance of bread and cardamom seemed to gather more fully in the room. The very silence among the customers became softer, as though each person present could feel, without needing proof, that this place had once again begun to notice them completely. The cat made his rounds. He inspected the cooling buns. He patrolled the flour shelves. He paused by the cupboard, then the oven, then the side door. At one point, he leapt lightly onto the bench, beside the old man in the green scarf, who bowed his head and said, "Ah, better." The cat blinked once, which, in his language, might have meant anything. From, of course, to "you are welcome." At the height of the hidden hour, when all the small tables were occupied and snow pressed white against the lane outside, Lina stood behind the work table with flour on her wrists and felt the bakery open around her like a living thing, returning to breath. Not because business was good, not because the pastries were perfect, not because any visible spell had been cast, but because the room was once more shaped by old kindness set into motion, and that was the hidden heart of the story. The cat was not merely guarding flour and fire, he was guarding attentiveness. He was keeping watch over the ancient decision to prepare for the unseen hunger. He was the custodian of tenderness, the stern little warden of unrecorded generosity, the moonlit supervisor of every modest extra thing set aside for love's sake. The realization did not arrive like thunder. It settled like snow, quietly, completely, until the whole world looked changed. Beneath it, by the time the brass bell gave its soft, far note and the guests rose to leave, Lina no longer felt merely astonished by the midnight bakery. She felt responsible to it, which is another way of saying that she had, without quite noticing, the moment it happened, become part of its keeping. Mistress Vale saw this, though she said nothing, until the last cup had been washed and the side door bolted. Then she crossed the kitchen, touched Lina's sleeve once, and said, "Tomorrow we begin earlier. There are things the town has forgotten, and we may have to remember them on its behalf." Lina looked at the cat. He was already seated by the stairs, silver-eyed and composed, as though he had expected Precisely this. Outside, snow lay thick on the rooftops and chimneys. Inside, the covered bowl of kindness starter breathed softly in its cupboard, and somewhere, beyond the bakery walls, the sleeping town held more loneliness, more weariness, more unasked for need than anyone, by daylight, ever quite admitted. To answer that fully, they would have to do more than keep the hidden hour. They would have to restore the wider pattern, and that, you may imagine, would change everything just enough. Good evening, and welcome back to the narrow old town, where the chimneys lean into the winter sky, where snow settles softly on the roof lines, and where, in one warm bakery after midnight, a silver-eyed cat keeps watch over more than bread by the following night. Lina began before dusk, not because she had been told to hurry. Nothing in that bakery was ever made better by hurrying, but because certain kinds of care must be prepared for in advance, and she had begun to understand that the hidden hour did not truly begin when the side door opened. It began much earlier, in the quiet decisions that shaped what would be waiting when it did. So while the last daylight customers came and went through the front, while baskets were filled and coins counted, and the ordinary business of flour and crust and pastry moved along its familiar rails, Lina worked another pattern underneath it all. She set aside plain rolls before they could be claimed by the evening shelves. She wrapped 2 honey cakes, not for sale, but for whoever might need sweetness without explanation. She poured a flask of warm milk and tucked beside it a pinch of nutmeg in paper. She filled 1 small jar with broth thickened with barley and thyme. She folded 3 sheets of writing paper with care and tied them with blue thread. She set a child's spoon beside a shallow bowl. She checked the rosemary stock twice, and from the fresh batch of dough mixed with the kindness starter, she shaped 6 small moon breads, smoothing each crescent with the flat of her palm, as though the gesture itself mattered. The cat observed all of this from the upper shelf with profound seriousness. Sometimes he approved by doing nothing at all. Sometimes he disapproved by appearing suddenly beside the wrong choice and looking at it until Lina reconsidered. At one point, she reached for the brighter jam, made from summer cherries, thinking a little color might be welcome against the winter gloom. The cat descended at once, crossed the table, and planted himself squarely before the jar of quince instead. Lina looked from one preserve to the other. "You truly are impossible," she murmured. The cat remained where he was. A moment later, she chose the quince. That evening, the bakery smelled especially rich, not louder, not sweeter in any overwhelming way, only deeper. Brown butter warming in the pan, bread crust, orange peel, rosemary brushed between fingers, milk just beginning to steam, cinnamon opened by heat, flour dust hanging luminous in the slanted gold of the lamps. The great oven gave off a low, steady warmth that touched the old wood walls and seemed to gather them closer. Outside, winter pressed its cold face to the town. Inside, warmth was being arranged with intention. Mistress Vale moved through it all with her usual composure, though Lina noticed something newly at ease in her. She tied on her dark blue shawl before midnight with a motion almost ceremonial. In its familiarity, she checked the side door latch. She placed the little brass bell on the back counter. She lit the lower lamps and left the brighter ones dark. She touched the cupboard once, briefly, before opening the hidden hour, as one might open a song long known by heart, and slowly, almost without noticing. The bakery returned to itself, completely. The first midnight guest arrived, while snow was still slipping, in fine soft curtains. Through the lane, it was the old man, in the moss-green scarf, his cane dusted white at the tip, his brows silvered with frost. Yet tonight, when Lina opened the door, he smiled, before he crossed the threshold, as though he had sensed, from the lane, that something within was warmer than before. "Ah," he said, breathing in, "there you are." It was such a simple thing to say, and yet the words seemed to settle into the room like a blessing. He took his seat by the oven. Moon bread was ready. Butter had been softened. Tea was poured before he asked. The cat leapt to the bench beside him and sat with his paws tucked beneath him, like a magistrate receiving reports. The old man bowed his head to him with quiet respect. Soon came the seamstress from the riverside quarter, carrying a basket, mended at the handle with blue thread. Then the watchman, cheeks red from the cold. Then the musician, with ink on her cuffs and her folded music sheets tucked under one arm. Then the woman, who smelled faintly of hay and rosemary, whose owls never settled before snow. Each entered with that same slight pause at the threshold, the pause of someone stepping into a place not merely open, but ready for them. Lina began to understand that readiness itself has a fragrance. It smells like warm bread, already sliced, like cups warmed before tea is poured, like butter softened by the hearth instead of served cold, like one extra chair pulled nearer. The oven, like the knowledge, impossible to prove, and yet unmistakable, that someone has considered your arrival before you appeared. The bakery held that fragrance now, and because it did, stranger guests returned as well. A small soot-winged creature emerged from the chimney nook after accepting its bowl of milk and settled for a while atop the bread shelves, folding its dark wings like a shawl. Something pale and moth-like tapped softly at the window and was answered by a sugared crumb placed just so beside the latch. Somewhere outside, in the lane, hooves, or something very like hooves, paused and shifted patiently, while Mistress Vale wrapped a fennel loaf in cloth and set it on the step. Without looking out, "No one," exclaimed. No one broke the hush. The bakery simply widened enough to include what belonged to its hour, and yet the true work of the night had not begun. That came later, when the last of the ordinary midnight guests had been served, and the brass bell on the counter remained silent, as though waiting. Mistress Vale looked at Lina. Lina looked at the cat. The cat, in turn, hopped down from the bench and went directly to the basket by the pantry door. It was already prepared. Inside were wrapped loaves, 2 jars of broth, little packets of sugared bread crusts, a flask of milk, spare mittens, knitted in dark wool, a folded shawl, a small candle lantern, and a paper packet of rosemary biscuits tied with string. Mistress Vale lifted the basket and handed it to Lina. "There are things the town has forgotten," she said quietly. "We begin remembering them tonight." The cat was already at the stair, so once more, Lina wound on her scarf, buttoned her coat, changed into her older boots, and followed him upward through the sleeping house. The upper rooms greeted her differently now, no longer strange. They felt entrusted. The old prints, the beams darkened by years, the cedar and lavender hush of the sloping passages, the square trapdoor opening onto the roof walk, all of it seemed part of a pattern she had entered fully. When she lifted herself out into the winter air, the town spread around her, not as a puzzle, but as a map of quiet obligations. Snow still lay soft along the tiles, though the sky had cleared enough for stars to show between thin passing veils of cloud. Chimneys breathed their warm grey columns into the night. Here and there, a window remained lit behind curtains. The church clock showed well after midnight. The river beyond the houses shone black and silver between frozen edges. The cat led on first to the rooftop hearth in the hidden garden, where Lina lit the rosemary twine again and set fresh crumbs beside the bare little tree with its tiny bells. This time, the bells answered with a more even music, so faint it seemed less heard than felt. Then to the dovecote, where the doves stirred sleepily as she placed new seed and tucked in 3 small paper slips Mistress Vale had written earlier in her neat slanted hand. One read, "For the night nurse near the East Bridge." Another, "For the old couple above the cobblers." The third, "For anyone keeping watch beside a sick bed." Lina did not ask how the doves would know at that hour. It seemed enough that they did. Then to the grain loft, where the renewed yeast rested warm in its ceramic jar, and the scent rising there was fuller now, less lonely. Then to the chimney nook, where the soot-winged little being accepted milk with grave delight and disappeared into warm brick once more. Then farther still, over joined roofs Lina had never crossed before, past stacks of firewood silvered by frost and dormer windows blind with sleep, past a schoolhouse roof where snow lay thick as folded wool, past the old tailor's garret and the cooper's loft, and the narrow alley where winter laundry lines hung stiff and white. At each place the cat paused, only long enough for the needed task. A packet tucked beneath an eave, a shawl left on a sheltered windowsill, a lantern set, burning low beside a hidden attic door, a jar of broth lowered by cord into a courtyard where a single candle glowed behind a basement pane, a parcel of sugared crusts placed just inside the archway near the river steps, a pair of mittens left on the ledge of the bell ringer's tower stair. Nothing grand, nothing announced, only modest mercies moved into place with patient precision, and slowly, almost without noticing, Lina felt the town answering, not literally, not with voices rising from the chimneys or windows thrown open. In astonishment, the answer came in subtler ways. A dark window above the cobbler's shop dimmed at last, its candle extinguished. After too many wakeful hours, a figure at the East Bridge, seen only briefly from the rooftop line, lifted a flask from a windowsill and stood holding it in both hands before going inside. A lantern hidden under the arch near the river steps burned steadier once its parcel had been found. A draught that had lingered cold along the old north ridge softened. Even the smoke from the chimneys seemed to rise more cleanly, as though some small hesitation in the town's breathing had eased. Lina did not speak for some time. When at last she did, it was only to whisper. It was never only the bakery. The cat looked back at her, moonlight caught in his silver eyes. No, that look seemed to say, of course not, because the bakery, she now understood, was the heart of the pattern, but not its whole shape. Its midnight hour fed outward into the town like warmth through joined walls. A bowl of broth here, a sweet bun there, a light left where someone might need. courage to finish the dark walk home, a warm parcel arriving just before a person admitted to themselves that they had reached the edge of what they could carry alone. All of it part of the same old grammar of care. The hidden hour did not exist merely to comfort those who found the back door. It existed to remind the whole town, quietly and without vanity, that tenderness could still circulate after midnight. And that was why the cat had guarded the rooftops, why the dovecote mattered, why the little rooftop hearth could not be left cold, why the bakery's inner cupboard held not treasure, but preparation. A town, like a loaf, rose best when tended from within. By the time they returned to the bakery, the eastern sky had begun the faintest paling behind the chimneys. Not dawn yet, not truly, but the first soft loosening of the deepest dark. Inside, the ovens glowed, steady and content. The room smelled of warm milk, bread, extinguished rosemary, and the last sweet trace of cardamom. The cupboard stood, slightly ajar, and from within, the kindness starter breathed in its crock, fed and living and ready. Mistress Vale had set out tea. Of course she had. She poured for Lina without comment and gave the cat a saucer of warmed cream, which he accepted as one accepting tribute from a grateful kingdom. They sat in the low hush before dawn, saying very little. At such an hour, words felt larger than necessary. But after a while, Lina asked the question that had been gathering in her since the rooftops. Will the town know? Mistress Vale cradled her cup between both hands. Not all at once, she said, not in the way people know, a headline or a proclamation. Most may never know at all, but they may sleep better, or find the strength to write the letter, or feel less alone on the bridge, or remember tomorrow to leave a little soup for a neighbor, or mend a cuff without charge, or tuck an extra apple into a child's pocket. Kindness moves strangely. It travels by ways no map can fully show. Lina thought of the parcels they had left and the silent windows that had dimmed. And that is enough? Mistress Vale smiled over the rim of her tea. It has always been enough to begin with. From the bench by the oven came the soft sound of the cat washing one paw. Morning preparations began not long after. The front shutters were opened to let in the pale winter light. The day trays were arranged. Seed loaves were brushed. Aprons were tied. The ordinary world returned, as it always did, with its baskets and preferences and practical hunger. The first customers arrived, rosy from the cold. A schoolboy bought 2 buns. A woman from the market asked for rye. The coal merchant stamped his boots and complained amiably about the weather. Daylight spread across the window glass in a clean grey wash, and yet the bakery was no longer merely ordinary, or perhaps it had never been ordinary, and Lina could finally see it when the tired father came in again with his drowsy child tucked against his shoulder. Lina wrapped an extra sweet bun without waiting to be told. When the old couple from above the cobblers stopped by, a brown bread, Mistress Vale slipped a paper packet of rosemary biscuits into their basket so discreetly that they only found it on the doorstep later, when the schoolboy hesitated over whether he had enough coins. The cat from the windowsill gave him such a level stare that Lina nearly laughed and quietly lowered the price by 1 copper. The hidden hour was no longer separate from the day. It had rooted through it, little by little. Over the next nights and mornings, the town changed in the smallest visible ways. A lantern began appearing on the East Bridge whenever snow was forecast. Someone left broth outside the watchman's post. On bitter evenings, a parcel of mending thread showed up for the seamstress before she admitted hers was gone. The schoolhouse received a paper sack of currant buns. On examination mornings at the riverside, a widow who had not spoken much since autumn began ordering tea leaves again. Even the church verger was heard to remark, in puzzled approval, that people seemed kinder this winter than the last. No one traced the pattern exactly. No one stood in the square and explained it. There was no announcement, no banner, no public praise. That was not the way of such things. The cat continued his rounds as before. By day, he supervised the flower shelves, slept in shafts of light, and appeared at suspiciously exact moments whenever someone forgot the quince preserve, neglected the milk bowl, or counted the plain rolls too tightly. By night, he returned to the oven mouth, the rooftop paths, the cupboard threshold, the side door. He remained dignified, composed, mildly severe, and entirely uninterested in gratitude offered too loudly. But now, from time to time, Lina would catch him in some unguarded softness, sitting beside the old man in the green scarf, while Moonbread cooled nearby, resting on the folded blue shawl after service ended, closing his eyes when the rooftop bells answered evenly in the snow, pausing in the lane before the hidden door, as if to make certain the warmth behind it was properly alive. He approved, Lina thought, not of being admired, but of the work continuing. Winter slowly began to loosen, not quickly. This was not that sort of story. Snow still gathered on the roof edges. Frost still patterned the windows. The dawns remained pale, and the chimneys busy. But some mornings, the icicles thinned. The river sighed more audibly. Beneath its cold skin, a drop of water now and then traced the edge of the eaves. The town began imagining spring, though no one said so directly, and the bakery's midnight hour grew warmer than ever, not busier perhaps, though some nights more guests came than before. A woman traveling by moonlight who could not eat by day, a lamplighter with a parcel for his sister, a childless couple who sat together in the corner, sharing herb cake and saying little, a pale visitor from the rooftops who accepted sugared crumbs with immense solemnity, a man who had come only for tea and left with bread, broth, and the look of someone who had remembered. Suddenly, that gentleness still existed. Every one of them was received. Every one of them found something, waiting. And because this is a bedtime story, because every good wandering must eventually find its hearth again, let us come at last to one especially quiet morning. It came after a clear, cold night, filled with stars. The town had slept deeply. No chimney smoked unevenly. No hidden hearth had gone unattended. The dovecote was stocked. The rooftop bowls were full. The old north seam held firm. The kindness starter, fed at midnight, had risen beautifully. Moonbreads cooled on their racks, in perfect crescents. The side door had closed on the last guest with a hush that felt less like ending than blessing. Inside the bakery, dawn gathered gently. Lina had finished sweeping. Mistress Vale was shaping the first day loaves. The lamps had been turned low. Light from the window lay soft and pearly across the floorboards. The room smelled of flour, brick warmth, and the clean, faint sweetness that comes after baking has gone exactly right. And there, beside the great brick oven, on a folded sack, warmed through by the night's last heat, slept the silver-eyed cat. One paw was tucked beneath him, the other rested lightly over his nose. His fur rose and fell with calm, measured breaths. The soot mark on one ear had finally worn away. He looked smaller in sleep and older somehow, and entirely at peace. Lina paused in the doorway just to look at him. There are moments when understanding does not arrive as explanation, but as stillness. This was one of them. She understood now that some places are held together by visible labor and invisible tenderness both. That bread and mercy are not such distant cousins. That warmth prepared in advance can change a night, and many nights can alter a town. That magic, in the deepest sense, may sometimes be nothing more mysterious than care practiced faithfully, until walls remember it, and that guardians are not always grand creatures out of legend. Sometimes they are quiet, silver-eyed, and furred with moonlit smoke, watching from flower shelves while the ovens breathe. Mistress Vale came to stand beside her. Neither of them spoke at first. Then, very softly, so as not to wake him, Lina said, "Do you think he knows?" Mistress Vale looked at the sleeping cat, then at the room, then at the racks of cooling bread, and the low, warm light along the bricks. "Oh yes," she said. "He knows." Beyond the windows, the town was waking. Boots would soon sound in the lane. The front bell would ring. Orders would be placed. Cones would change hands. Aprons would flower. Morning would become afternoon, and afternoon evening. The bakery would return, as it always did, to ordinary business. And yet, beneath that ordinary life, the hidden hour would remain, ready and breathing. The cupboard would be stocked, the rooftop paths remembered, the little bowls refilled, the rolls set aside, the extra sweetness wrapped for tomorrow, the warmth kept back for whoever might come, needing it, night after night, winter after winter, as though the world itself were holding its breath and being gently persuaded once more to soften. So let the story settle there, in the narrow old town, in the warm brick hush before the day begins, in the secret knowledge that somewhere a side door still opens after midnight, for the wakeful, the weary, and the quietly magical, in the steady hands of a young apprentice who now understands the soul of the place. She serves in the calm watch of an old baker who never mistook efficiency for care, and in the small sleeping shape of a silver-eyed cat curled by the oven where the bread cools under the stars. May that be your last image tonight. Warm brick, old wood floors, the faint fragrance of cardamom and rosemary, snowlight paling at the window, and one faithful guardian at rest at last, knowing the bakery is safe, the hidden hour restored, and the world, for now, made a little kinder before dawn.